The higher self, the excess of being over awareness. A philosophical framework for understanding consciousness, selfhood, and the limits of access. By CCidFuentes, March 26th, 2026. Abstract. This essay proposes a framework for understanding the higher self through what it calls the principle of restricted access. The idea that consciousness does not present reality or the self in full, but only a limited cross-section shaped by biological and cognitive constraints. From this perspective, perception, thought, self-awareness, even individuality, are structured by limits of access rather than by total disclosure. The essay argues that what is commonly called the higher self is not a separate entity, but the excess of being over awareness, that portion of the self which exceeds what can be stabilized within the conscious experience. In doing so, it offers a distinct formulation of a long-standing philosophical intuition, namely that the self as experienced is not the whole of what it is. Introduction. Human beings often live as though their experience is complete. What we see, hear and think presents itself as a coherent and sufficient account of reality. The world appears stable, intelligible and contained within the bounds of perception. The self appears equally defined, located within the limits of awareness and identifiable through thought, memory and identity. Yet this apparent completeness may be misleading. There are strong reasons to believe that what we experience is not the full structure of reality, but a highly constrained interface with it. The same may be true of the self. What we take to be the entirety of who we are may, in fact, be only a limited expression of something more extensive, something that exceeds what can be perceived, accessed, or stabilized within conscious awareness. This essay is built upon a single organizing idea, which can be stated as follows. Consciousness does not present reality or the self in full, but only a restricted cross-section shaped by biological and cognitive constraints. This can be understood as a principle of restricted access. What is available to awareness is not the totality of what exists, but only that portion which can be processed within the limits of the system through which it is encountered. If this is the case, then the implications are significant. The limits that restrict our perception of the world may be the same limits that restrict our perception of ourselves. What we experience as reality and what we experience as the self may therefore be structured by the same underlying constraint. This essay develops a simple but far-reaching claim that consciousness is a narrow band within a wider field of being, and that what we call the higher self is not a separate entity, but the excess of what we are over what we can experience. It further suggests that this excess may not be marginal, but substantial. What we are may extend far beyond what can be contained within conscious awareness, and what we experience may represent only a minimal expression of a more extensive reality. 1. The limits of perception. Human beings experience the world through a fundamentally limited mode of access. What appears to us as a stable and coherent reality is, upon closer examination, a highly selective representation, shaped by the constraints of our sensory and cognitive systems. The apparent completeness of experience is therefore not evidence of its accuracy, but a consequence of how effectively it masks its own limitations. What is presented as totality is in fact a construction that conceals as much as it reveals. A clear illustration of this limitation can be found in the structure of human perception itself. The electromagnetic spectrum, which encompasses a vast range of wavelengths, extends far beyond the narrow band of visible light detectable by the human eye. Infrared radiation, ultraviolet light, Radio waves, X-rays and gamma radiation all exist as objective features of the physical world, yet remain entirely imperceptible to unaided human senses. Similarly, auditory perception is confined to a limited range of frequencies, excluding both lower and higher vibrations that nonetheless exist and can be measured. Even within the body, countless physiological processes, such as cellular activity, neural signaling, and hormonal regulation occur continuously without entering conscious awareness. These limitations are not marginal, they are structural. What is available to perception constitutes only a minute fraction of what exists. The overwhelming majority of physical processes occur outside the bounds of direct experience, inaccessible not because they are hidden, but because the human organism is not equipped to register them. From within this constrained interface, however, there is no immediate indication of what is absent. The world appears complete precisely because the system that presents it excludes what it cannot process. This can be understood as a direct expression of the principle of restricted access. Perception does not reveal reality in full, but only that portion of it that can be processed within the limits of the human sensory system. What is excluded is not necessarily less real, but simply beyond the range of what can be accessed. Despite these limitations, human beings tend to operate under the implicit assumption that what is perceived constitutes reality in its entirety. This assumption is rarely examined, yet it underpins everyday experience. The world as it appears is treated as the world as it is. However, such a position becomes increasingly difficult to sustain once the constraints of perception are acknowledged. If substantial portions of physical reality lie beyond sensory detection, then perception cannot be equated with totality. It follows that experience must be understood not as a direct presentation of reality, but as a mediated and partial construction. The role of biological evolution further reinforces this conclusion. Human sensory systems did not develop to provide an exhaustive account of reality, but to enable effective interaction with the environment. Perception is therefore oriented toward utility rather than truth in any absolute sense. It selects, simplifies, and stabilizes information in order to support survival and action. What is excluded is not unnecessarily unreal, but irrelevant to the organism's immediate functioning. The result is a model of the world that is efficient but inherently incomplete. From this perspective, experience can be more accurately described as a compressed interface with reality, rather than a transparent window onto it. It presents a version of the world that is usable but not complete. The implication of this is significant. If our access to external reality is limited and filtered, then it is reasonable to consider that our access to ourselves may be subject to similar constraints. In this sense, the limits of perception do not merely restrict what we see. They reveal something more fundamental about the nature of experience itself. What we encounter is not reality in its full structure, but a narrow and highly processed band of it. The recognition of this limitation does not undermine experience, but reframes it. It suggests that what lies beyond perception is not absence, but excess, an indication that reality extends further than our current mode of awareness can encompass. Indeed, the scale of this excess may not be incremental, but profound. What appears to us as a complete and coherent world may represent only a minimal slice of a vastly more complex structure, one whose depth and extent cannot be fully conceived from within the limits of the system that perceives it. 2. The brain as a system of compression. If perception establishes that human experience is limited in scope, the structure of the brain reveals why this limitation is necessary. The brain does not function as a passive receiver that presents reality in full. Rather, It operates as an active system of selection, reduction, and compression. Its primary task is not to reproduce the world as it is, but to construct a manageable representation of it. At any given moment, the amount of information available to the brain vastly exceeds what could be processed consciously. Sensory input alone, including visual, auditory, tactile, and internal signals, arrives in volumes far beyond what awareness can accommodate. In order to function effectively, the brain must therefore filter this information, prioritizing what is relevant to immediate survival, decision-making, and action. This filtering is not incidental, it is foundational. Without it, coherent experience would collapse under the weight of unstructured data. This process can be understood as a second expression of the principle of restricted access. Just as perception limits what can be detected, the brain further limits what can be processed, organizing overwhelming amounts of information into a form that can be handled within a finite system. What reaches awareness is not the total input, but a reduced and structured output. Crucially, much of this processing occurs outside conscious awareness. Emotional responses are often initiated before they are recognized. Decisions are frequently made before they are justified, and patterns are detected long before they are articulated. What appears in consciousness is therefore not the raw output of cognition, but the result of extensive pre-conscious processing. The mind operates on multiple levels, with consciousness occupying only a narrow and selective layer. This can be observed directly. A feeling can arise before its cause is understood. A conclusion can appear before the reasoning behind it is accessible. Words can be formed before the full structure of the thought is clear. In each case, awareness receives the result of a process it does not witness. This layered structure suggests that consciousness should not be understood as the entirety of the mind, but as a limited interface built upon deeper processes. It presents conclusions without always revealing the mechanisms that produced them. The sense of immediacy and clarity that characterizes conscious thought can therefore be misleading, giving the impression of completeness where there is, in fact, significant omission. The implications of this are substantial. If the brain compresses both external reality and internal processing into a simplified form, then conscious experience cannot be taken as a full account of either the world or the self. It is instead a highly efficient but necessarily incomplete representation. In this way, consciousness may be better understood not as the center of the mind, but as its surface. Beneath it lies a far more extensive system that is dynamic, complex, and largely inaccessible, upon which conscious experience depends but which it does not fully reveal. The greater portion of cognition remains outside awareness, not as an exception but as the rule. 3. The self as a limited interface. If the brain compresses reality into a manageable form, then the sense of self that emerges within consciousness must also be understood as a partial construction. What we ordinarily refer to as the self presents itself as unified, continuous, and transparent into introspection. Yet this impression is, in large part, a product of the same filtering and compression processes that shape our perception of the external world. At this point, the principle of restricted access applies not only to what we perceive, but to what we are. The same system that limits access to reality also limits access to the self. What appears in awareness is not the full structure of the individual, but a reduced and organized representation of it. The majority of what constitutes an individual lies beyond direct awareness. Memory is not a complete archive accessible at will, but a dynamic system in which only fragments are available at any given time. Behavioral patterns develop through repetition and conditioning, often operating automatically without conscious deliberation. Emotional responses arise from underlying processes that precede reflection, while intuitive judgments and associations emerge without a clear account of how they were formed. These elements, including memory, habit, affect, and unconscious processing, are not peripheral to the self, they are central to it. This can be observed directly. A reaction can occur before it is understood. A habit can guide behavior without being consciously chosen. A memory can shape a decision without being explicitly recalled. In each case, something within the individual is active, yet not accessible in full to awareness. Despite this, consciousness presents only a selective cross-section of these processes. It offers a narrative of the self rather than its full structure. This narrative is coherent enough to support identity and action, but it is necessarily incomplete. Much of what shapes behavior remains implicit, influencing decisions and experiences without entering awareness into a fully articulated form. As a result, individuals often act, feel, and respond in ways that cannot be entirely explained from within their conscious perspective. This gap between what we are and what we can access gives rise to a fundamental asymmetry. The self, as it exists, is more extensive than the self as it is experienced. Awareness does not encompass the totality of the individual. It reveals only a limited interface through which the deeper system becomes partially visible. The implication of this is clear. The self cannot be reduced to conscious thought, reflection, or intention alone. These are components of a broader structure, not its entirety. To equate the self with what is consciously available is therefore to mistake a representation for the whole. In this sense, the self must be understood as exceeding its own awareness. What we experience as I is not the full extent of what we are, but a constrained point of access within a more complex and largely inaccessible totality. What appears as a single unified perspective may therefore be comparable to a surface through which a far more extensive structure becomes partially visible. The coherence of this surface is not evidence of completeness, but a condition of usability. It allows the system to function while concealing the scale of what it cannot display at once. 4. The higher self reconsidered. The notion of a higher self has often been presented as though it refers to a distinct entity, an elevated version of the individual existing elsewhere, whether in another realm, plane, or state of being. Such interpretations, while intuitively appealing, introduce a form of separation that is not required to account for the insight from which the concept arises. A more precise understanding emerges when the higher self is reconsidered not as something separate, but as something continuous with the individual, yet not fully accessible to conscious awareness. At this stage, the principle of restricted access becomes decisive. If perception limits access to reality and cognition limits access to information, then it follows that awareness must also limit access to the self. What appears in consciousness is not the entirety of what one is, but a reduced and structured expression of it. The idea of a higher self originates from a simple but profound recognition that what we are exceeds what we can access. As established in earlier sections, both perception and cognition operate under significant constraints. The brain filters, compresses, and organizes information in such a way that only a limited portion becomes consciously available. This applies not only to external reality, but equally to the internal structure of the self. Much of what constitutes an individual, including memory, affective dynamics, unconscious processing, and behavioral patterning, remains beyond direct access, even as it continues to shape experience and action. Within this framework, the higher self can be understood as a conceptual response to this excess. It names that portion of the self which lies beyond the threshold of awareness, not as a separate existence, but as an extension of the same underlying being. The sense that there is more to oneself, more depth, more coherence, more potential for understanding, does not require the existence of another self located elsewhere. Rather, it reflects the structural incompleteness of conscious access. What is often overlooked, however, is the scale of this excess. If awareness is confined to a narrow band, then what lies beyond it is not simply an adjacent layer waiting to be revealed, but potentially a far more extensive domain that cannot be held within the limits of conscious experience. It is not only that something is hidden, but that what is hidden may exceed the capacity of awareness to contain it in full. This point can be clarified by comparison. A visual field does not expand to include the entire electromagnetic spectrum simply by extending its range. There are structural limits to what can be registered at all. In the same way, the higher self may not be something that can be fully brought into awareness, even in principle, because awareness itself is a finite mode of access. What exceeds it is not merely unknown, but not fully containable within its structure. To treat the higher self as a distinct entity therefore risks misinterpreting this insight. It externalizes what is, in fact, internal to the structure of the individual, transforming a limitation of access into a division within being. By contrast, to understand the higher self as continuous with the self preserves both the intuition of depth and the coherence of the individual as a single, albeit complex, system. The higher self is therefore not a hidden presence waiting to be discovered, nor a distant version of the individual existing beyond the current state. It is better understood as the name given to a fundamental condition, that awareness does not exhaust being. What we encounter in consciousness is only a portion of what we are, and the recognition of this limitation gives rise to the idea of a higher self. In this sense, the higher self does not point to something separate, but to something implicit. It is not an object to be located, but a boundary to be recognized, the boundary between what is accessible and what exceeds access. Yet this boundary does not behave like a fixed edge. It behaves more like a horizon. The further awareness extends, the more it reveals that what lies beyond it is not diminishing, but receding in proportion to the attempt to grasp it. What appears at first as a hidden remainder begins to take on a different character. It is not simply what has not yet been accessed, but what may not be fully exhaustible by access at all. The higher self is, in its most precise formulation, the excess of being over awareness. It is not something beyond us, but something within us that cannot be fully experienced. It is the indication that what we are is not simply larger than what we perceive, but structured in such a way that no single mode of awareness can fully contain it. 5. Planes as levels of access. The concept of planes is frequently invoked to describe different layers or domains of reality, often imagined as distinct worlds or ontological regions existing alongside one another. However, such interpretations risk reifying what may be better understood in functional terms. Rather than referring to separate locations, the idea of planes can be more precisely interpreted as differences in levels of access, that is, variations in how reality is perceived, processed, and integrated. Within the framework established so far, this reinterpretation follows directly from the principle of restricted access. If perception limits what can be detected and cognition limits what can be processed, then it is reasonable to conclude that different planes correspond not to different worlds, but to different configurations of access within the same underlying reality. Just as human beings are capable of detecting only a narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum, our access to reality as a whole may be similarly constrained. What lies beyond this accessible range is not absent, but simply unavailable to our current mode of awareness. The language of planes can therefore be understood as a way of gesturing toward these inaccessible or only partially accessible domains. In this sense, differences between planes can be understood as differences in perceptual bandwidth and cognitive integration. A change in plane would not involve a transition to another physical location, but a shift in the degree to which reality is accessible or intelligible. This can be clarified through comparison. A colour that cannot be seen does not belong to another world. It lies outside the range of the visual system. A sound beyond the limits of hearing is not located elsewhere. It is simply not registered. In a similar way, a change in the structure of access could, in principle, reveal aspects of reality that are currently unavailable, not because they are distant, but because they fall outside the conditions under which awareness operates. Variations in awareness, whether through reflection, altered states, or increased coherence of cognition, can give the impression of accessing deeper or broader aspects of reality. These shifts do not require the existence of separate worlds. They can be accounted for in terms of changes in how information is processed and experienced. What gives rise to the intuition of distinct planes, however, may be the magnitude of these differences. If the range of possible access varies significantly, then the resulting experiences may appear qualitatively different than merely more or less detailed. At a certain point, a change in access may not feel like an extension of the same reality, but like an encounter with something altogether different. The language of separate planes may therefore reflect not a literal division of worlds, but the limits of how radically different modes of access can be described from within a single frame of reference. When the structure of experience changes beyond a certain threshold, continuity is no longer felt, even if it remains. This interpretation preserves the intuitive appeal of the concept, while avoiding unnecessary metaphysical commitments. It allows for the possibility that reality is structured in ways that exceed current access, without requiring those structures to be conceived as spatially or ontologically distinct realms. The notion of planes, thus, becomes a way of describing gradients of access rather than divisions of existence. The conclusion that follows is that planes do not describe distinct locations, but variations in the depth and scope of access to reality. They refer not to where we are, but to how much of what is can be perceived and integrated at any given time. If this is taken seriously, then what appears to be a single stable world may be only one level of access within a far wider structure. The difference between what is available and what is not may not be marginal, but structural. What is experienced as reality may therefore be one configuration among many possible modes of access, most of which remain beyond the range of awareness. 6. The question of separation. The experience of individuality presents itself as both immediate and unquestionable. Each person appears as a distinct center of awareness, bounded by a body and defined by a unique perspective. This apparent separation is reinforced by practical realities. Individuals occupy different locations, possess different memories, and act independently within the world. At the level of everyday experience, the distinction between self and other is both functional and necessary. However, the question remains whether this separation is absolute or whether it reflects the limits of perception and access rather than the structure of reality itself. Within the framework developed so far, this question can be approached through the principle of restricted access. If perception limits what can be detected, cognition limits what can be processed, and awareness limits what can be accessed, then the separation between individuals may also be shaped by these same constraints. What appears as a boundary in experience may in part be a boundary in access. If the self is understood as a limited interface within a wider field of being, then individuality can be more precisely described as a form of localization rather than isolation. Each person represents a particular configuration of information, memory, and perception within a broader system. In this sense, the boundaries between individuals do not necessarily mark complete divisions in what exists, but rather divisions in what can be accessed from a given point of view. This distinction can be clarified through simple examples. Two observers watching the same landscape from different positions do not share the same view. Each sees something the other does not. One may see the river, the other the road. Their perspectives are separated, yet the landscape itself is not divided in the same way. The difference lies in access, not in the underlying reality. A similar structure appears within a single individual. Different processes in the same brain can operate without access to one another. A person may act on a habit without consciously choosing it, or feel an emotion without fully understanding its origin. These processes are distinct and partially inaccessible, yet they do not belong to separate selves. They are different operations within a single system. What appears unified at one level contains divisions, and what appears divided may belong to a deeper unity that is not directly visible. Extending this reasoning outward, two individuals do not share the same stream of consciousness, the same memories, or the same sensory input. Their access to reality is separated. However, this does not necessarily imply that the processes giving rise to those experiences are entirely separate in themselves. It may instead indicate that each individual occupies a distinct point of access within a wider structure that cannot be fully perceived from any single perspective. To be precise, the separation we experience is a separation of perspective, not necessarily a separation of underlying reality. Each person operates within their own limited field of access, which creates the appearance of independence and isolation. Yet the limits of that access prevent any individual from perceiving how their perspective relates to others at a deeper level. This does not eliminate individuality. The differences between persons remain real and significant at the level of experience and interaction. Each individual perspective is distinct, shaped by its own history, biology, and environment. However, these differences do not necessarily imply that individuals are fully separate in an absolute sense. They may instead reflect how a broader system is partitioned into distinct points of access. The implications of this is that separation may be understood as both real and limited. It is real insofar as it structures its experience and enables interaction, but limited insofar as it does not fully define the relationship between individuals and the wider reality in which they exist. The boundaries that define individuals may therefore be better understood as boundaries of access rather than boundaries of being. In this sense, separation may be real in practice but incomplete in principle. What appears as distinct at the level of conscious experience may not be as sharply divided at the level of the processes that give rise to it. The appearance of separation may therefore reflect the limits of awareness, rather than the full structure of what exists. 7. Philosophical parallels. The position developed thus far does not arise in isolation. The claim that the self exceeds its own awareness and that individual experience represents a limited access to a wider reality has appeared across multiple philosophical traditions in different forms. While these traditions differ in language, method, and metaphysical commitments, they converge on a shared intuition that what appears within consciousness does not exhaust the nature of what is. What unites these perspectives, however, is not a shared doctrine, but a shared problem. Each attempts in its own way to account for the discrepancy between what is experienced and what is. The framework developed here can be understood as a more explicit formulation of that same structural issue, that awareness does not provide total access, and that the self as experienced is therefore not the whole of what it is. One of the most systematic articulations of this insight can be found in the work of Baruch Spinoza, who proposed that all individual things are finite modes of a single infinite substance. In this framework, the human mind does not stand apart from reality, but constitutes a particular expression of it. However, as a finite mode, the individual can only apprehend a limited aspect of the infinite. What is known is therefore partial by necessity. The structure of the argument aligns closely with the one developed here. Limitation does not imply absence, but restricted access. The individual perspective does not define reality, but reflects a constrained way of encountering it. A comparable insight appears within Advaita Vedanta, which distinguishes between the apparent self and a deeper, more fundamental reality. According to this tradition, the true self is not identical with the individual perspective, but continuous with a broader ground of being. The apparent separation between individuals arises through limitation in awareness, not through absolute division. Here again, individuality can be understood as a restricted mode of access to a more expansive reality, rather than a fully separate existence. Within the Christian tradition, similar themes emerge in the writings of Meister Eckhart, who describes a ground of the soul that lies beyond the surface level of conscious thought. For Eckhart, this ground represents a depth within the individual that is not fully accessible to ordinary awareness, yet is continuous with the divine. The implication is consistent. What is consciously experienced does not define the full extent of what the self is. Despite their differences, these perspectives point toward the same structural insight. In each case, the self as it is experienced is not coextensive with the self as it is. What appears within awareness is only a limited expression of a more extensive reality, and the limits of that awareness shape what can be known. What remains implicit in these traditions, however, can now be stated more directly. The gap they identify between appearance and reality can be understood in terms of restricted access. The self exceeds its awareness not because it belongs to another realm, but because awareness itself is a limited mode of access within a wider field of being. The conclusion that follows is therefore twofold. First, the idea that the self exceeds its awareness is not novel, but a recurring insight within serious philosophical thought. Second, what is novel is the explicit framing of this insight as a structural feature of cognition itself. The gap between what is experienced and what is may not be an anomaly, but a necessary consequence of how access to reality is organized. 8. The recognition of incompleteness. Human consciousness is not only capable of representing aspects of the world, it is also capable of recognizing the limits of its own representation. This reflexive capacity distinguishes human awareness from mere perception. We do not simply encounter objects, events, and internal states. We are also aware that what we encounter is partial, that our understanding is incomplete, and that there remains more beyond what is presently accessible. Within the framework developed so far, this recognition can be understood as an internal consequence of restricted access. If awareness provides only a limited interface with reality and with the self, then it follows that consciousness will, at times, register its own incompleteness. The sense that there is more is not an external insight imposed on the mind, but a feature of how the mind is structured. This recognition emerges in multiple domains of experience. Intellectually, individuals are aware that their knowledge is provisional and subject to revision. There is always the possibility of further insight, deeper explanation, or broader understanding. Emotionally and psychologically, individuals often sense that their own motivations and responses are not fully transparent to them, that there are underlying processes shaping their behavior which they cannot entirely articulate. Even in ordinary reflection, there is a persistent awareness that memory is selective, that attention is limited, and that what is immediately present does not encompass the whole of what exists or what one is. This can be observed in simple moments. A thought begins before it is fully formed. A sentence is spoken before its structure is completely clear. A memory feels incomplete even as it is recalled. A decision is made, and only afterwards does its reasoning become visible. In each case, awareness does not present itself as total, but as something that both reveals and withholds at the same time. Importantly, this awareness of incompleteness is not imposed from outside consciousness. It arises from within it. Consciousness is structured in such a way that it can detect its own boundaries. It does not simply present a world, it presents that world as potentially incomplete. What is experienced is accompanied, however subtly, by the sense that it does not exhaust what could be known. From this perspective, the intuition of a higher self can be understood as a response to this condition. It does not necessarily arise from evidence of a distinct or external structure, but from the direct awareness that the self, as experienced, is not the entirety of the self as it exists. The sense that there is more to oneself, more depth, more coherence, more understanding, reflects the mind's encounter with its own limits of access. This interpretation preserves the force of the intuition, while avoiding unwarranted conclusions. It acknowledges that the experience of incompleteness is genuine, but refrains from specifying the exact nature of what lies beyond. In doing so, it maintains a distinction between recognizing a limit and asserting a specific structure beyond that limit. The conclusion that follows is that the intuition of a higher self does not depend on the existence of a separate domain or entity. Rather, it arises from the recognition that awareness does not exhaust being. Consciousness reveals not only what is present, but also that what is present is incomplete. In this sense, the idea of the higher self is not an addition to experience, but an implication of it. It is what follows when awareness encounters its own limits and recognizes that what it presents cannot be the whole. 9. Final synthesis. The argument developed throughout this essay converges on a single unifying claim: that consciousness constitutes a limited mode of access within a broader field of being. What appears as the fullness of experience is, upon examination, a constrained interface, shaped by the biological and cognitive structures through which reality is encountered. The self, as it is known in awareness, is therefore not the totality of what one is, but a particular manifestation within a wider and largely inaccessible system. This conclusion follows from the cumulative force of the preceding analysis. Human perception is demonstrably selective, capturing only a narrow segment of the physical world. The brain operates as a system of compression, filtering and organizing information in order to produce a coherent but simplified representation. The self, in turn, emerges within this framework as a partial interface, presenting a unified narrative while omitting the greater portion of the processes that constitute it. Taken together, these observations suggest that both our experience of the world and our experience of ourselves are structurally limited, not incidentally but by necessity. If this is the case, then consciousness cannot be taken as the complete account of being. What is given in awareness must be understood as a reduction, a functional representation that enables interaction but does not disclose the full extent of reality or the self. Experience does not merely reveal, it also conceals, and what it conceals may not be marginal but substantial. Within this framework, the concept of the higher self acquires a more precise meaning. It does not refer to a separate entity nor to a hidden domain that exists apart from the individual. Rather, it designates the structural fact that being exceeds experience. The higher self is not located elsewhere. It is implicit in the very limitations of conscious experience. To recognize that awareness is partial is already to recognize that what one is cannot be fully contained within it. The conclusion, therefore, is not an assertion of a new metaphysical structure, but a clarification of an existing condition. Consciousness is a narrow band within a wider field of being, and the self, as experienced, is a limited expression of a more extensive reality. The higher self is the name given to this excess, not as something separate from the individual, but as that which remains beyond the reach of experience. If this line of reasoning is taken seriously, then the self can no longer be understood as a bounded entity fully contained within conscious awareness. It must instead be approached as a limited expression of a structure whose intent may exceed what can be fully represented within experience at all. The implication is not simply that there is more to the self than is known, but that the scale of what remains unknown may be disproportionate to what is accessible. Conscious experience, however vivid or coherent, may represent only a minimal expression of what a human being is. Yet this excess should not be understood as a fixed remainder. It is not simply what lies beyond awareness waiting to be uncovered. Rather, it presents itself as something that recedes as it is approached. The more precisely the limits of awareness are understood, the more they suggest that what lies beyond them is not diminishing but expanding in proportion to the attempt to grasp it. In this sense, the recognition of the higher self does not extend beyond the bounds of reason. It arises directly from them. It is the consequence of taking seriously the limits of perception, cognition, and awareness, and following those limits to their logical conclusion. What emerges is not a departure from the self, but a clearer view of its structure, that we are, in every moment, more than we can experience, and that this more is not in a finite extension waiting to be reached, but an excess that cannot be fully enclosed within awareness itself. Closing reflection. The limits of perception do not define reality. They indicate that reality exceeds what can be apprehended through any given mode of access. What is revealed through experience is not the entirety of what exists, but a structured and constrained presentation of it. The recognition of this limitation does not diminish the validity of perception, but reframes its scope, situating it within a broader and more extensive context. What appears complete may in fact be only the portion that can be held within the narrow conditions of awareness. An analogous conclusion follows with respect to the self. The limits of awareness do not determine the full extent of what one is. Rather, they disclose that the self exceeds what can be consciously experienced. What appears within awareness, thought, feeling, identity, constitutes a particular expression of a more complex and largely inaccessible totality. To equate the self with what is immediately present in consciousness is therefore to mistake a partial representation for the whole. Within this framework, the higher self does not emerge as an object to be discovered, nor as a domain to be reached. It is not located elsewhere, nor does it exist as a separate entity awaiting access. Instead, it is implicit in the very structure of experience. It is present not only as something additional, but as that which remains beyond the limits of what can be known at any given moment. To speak of the higher self is therefore to articulate a condition rather than to identify a thing. It is to acknowledge that the self is not exhausted by its current expression, and that awareness, however immediate or vivid, does not fully disclose the nature of being. The higher self names this excess, not as a speculative construct, but as a necessary implication of the limits of perception and cognition. Yet this excess should not be understood as a fixed remainder. It is not simply what lies just beyond awareness waiting to be uncovered. Rather, it suggests a depth that may not be fully containable within any single mode of experience. The further one reflects on the limits of awareness, the more those limits appear less like final boundaries and more like points of disclosure. Places where what exceeds awareness becomes newly visible without ever becoming exhausted. What lies beyond them does not diminish as it is approached. It expands in proportion to the attempt to grasp it. In this sense, the recognition of the higher self does not require a departure from experience, but a more careful attention to its structure. Every moment of awareness already contains the indication of what lies beyond it. The awareness that what is given is incomplete, and that what is extends further than what can be grasped. To recognize this is not to transcend the self, but to see it more clearly. It is to understand that what we experience is not the full measure of what we are, and that the boundaries of awareness is not the edge of being, but the point at which being exceeds what can be known. Implications for spiritual thought. If the framework developed in this essay is taken seriously, it has implications for how spiritual ideas may be understood. Concepts such as God, transcendence, revelation, divine presence, and spiritual awakening have often been treated as referring to realities beyond ordinary human experience. Within the present framework, such concepts can be reconsidered in terms of access. What is described as spiritual may not necessarily point to a separate order of existence, but to the limits of how existence is ordinarily encountered. From this perspective, spiritual language can be understood as an attempt to speak about what exceeds the normal range of conscious access. The idea of God, for example, has frequently been associated with an ultimate or infinite reality that surpasses human comprehension. Without committing this essay to any single theological doctrine, that idea can be interpreted structurally. What is called the divine may correspond, at least in part, to the recognition that reality exceeds the limits within which human awareness ordinarily operates. In this sense, spiritual thought may be understood not as a rejection of finitude, but as a response to it. A similar implication follows with respect to experiences often described as spiritual. Moments of heightened clarity, unity, awe, stillness, or profound significance need not be treated as proof of a separate realm in order to be philosophically meaningful. They may instead reflect temporary shifts in the structure of access, moments in which the ordinary organization of perception, cognition, or self-awareness becomes less rigid, allowing a wider or more integrated mode of experience. Such states do not necessarily reveal another world. They may reveal more of this one than is usually available within the ordinary limits of awareness. This framework also offers a way of understanding why spiritual traditions so often speak in symbolic, paradoxical, or apophatic terms. If what is being described exceeds the structure of ordinary access, then direct language will tend to fail. The result is not irrationality, but pressure on language itself. Where access is partial, speech becomes indirect. Spiritual discourse may therefore be understood as the expression of a real encounter with limitation, even where its metaphors vary across the traditions. The same applies to concepts such as the soul, the divine image, or the deeper ground of the person. These need not be treated as separate substances in order to retain significance. They may refer, in part, to the recognition that the self is not exhausted by what appears in awareness. In this sense, spiritual anthropology and the present account converge. Both resist the reduction of the person to what is immediately accessible. This does not establish the truth of any particular religious system, nor does it collapse philosophy into theology. It does, however, suggest that spiritual thought may preserve an important insight, namely that human beings have long recognized that what is given in awareness is not the whole of what is, and that the excess beyond awareness may be of central importance. From this perspective, spirituality need not be understood as a movement away from reality, but as an attempt to respond to the fact that reality exceeds the forms in which it is ordinarily known. What is spiritual in this sense is not necessarily what lies elsewhere, but what becomes thinkable once the limits of access are taken seriously. Author's note: the central intuition of this essay is not historically unprecedented. What is intended as original is its formulation. The essay proposes that the higher self can be understood through a principle of restricted access, according to which consciousness presents neither reality nor the self in full, but only a constrained cross-section shaped by the limits of the system through which it is encountered. On this view, the higher self is not another being, but the excess of what one is over what one can experience. CCidFuentes, written in 2026.